I died freezing on the icy steps of the Harrington estate, clutching a terminal diagnosis I couldn't pay for while my family toasted to my sister's engagement inside. As my heart stopped, I didn't feel peace, I felt a burning, suffocating rage. Then I opened my eyes. It was July 14, 2018, 3 years before my pathetic death. The exact day my parents were going to falsely accuse me of stealing my sister's diamond heirloom and throw me out onto the streets. But this time, I'm not crying. I'm not begging. This time, I packed my bags and walked away first. The first thing I registered was the suffocating heat of the July sun, streaming through my bedroom window. I gasped, bolting upright, my hands frantically clawing at my own chest. There was no pain. There was no frostbite blackening my fingertips. The agonizing cough that had racked my lungs for the last 6 months of my previous life was gone. I looked down at my hands. They were smooth, young, and unblemished. I swung my legs over the edge of the plush, king-sized bed and stared at the calendar on my mahogany nightstand, the 14th of July, 2018. A harsh, breathless laugh escaped my lips. I was 21 again. I had come back. In my past life, this was the day that ruined me. It was the day my adopted sister, Alora, claimed her biological grandmother's antique sapphire necklace had gone missing. It was the day my mother, Madeline, and my father, Roman, tore my room apart, only to find the necklace stuffed inside my mattress. A blatant setup that I was too naive and hysterical to disprove. I had dropped to my knees. I had grabbed my father's trousers, sobbing, begging them to look at the security footage, swearing on my life I hadn't touched it. Roman had kicked me away. Madeline had looked at me with a disgust so profound it shattered my soul. And Theodore, my fiancé at the time, had stood in the doorway, shaking his head before wrapping a protective arm around a weeping Alora. They threw me out with nothing but the clothes on my back, freezing my bank accounts and blacklisting me from every respectable job in the city. The memory of their cold eyes sent a phantom chill down my spine. Says one. But this time, the tears didn't come. Only a cold, terrifying clarity remained. I checked the grandfather clock in the hallway. 2:00 p.m. They would be bursting through my door in exactly 30 minutes. I didn't waste a single second. I pulled my vintage leather trunk from the closet, the only piece of luggage I had bought with money earned from my secret college tutoring gig. I refused to take a single item bought with Harrington money. I threw in my basic clothes, my laptop, my passport, and the lockbox containing the $5,000 in cash I had painstakingly saved over 3 years. I stripped off the silk designer pajamas and changed into a simple white t-shirt and faded denim jeans. By 2:25 p.m., my trunk was packed, zipped, and waiting by the door. I sat on the edge of the mattress, scrolling through my phone, deleting contacts, Madeline, Roman, Theodore. I erased them all. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the sound of heavy, furious footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door violently swung open, crashing against the wall. Madeline stood there, her face twisted in a mask of aristocratic fury, her flawless blowout trembling with rage. Behind her stood Roman, his jaw clenched, and Alora dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Sophia," Madeline shrieked, marching into the room. "Where is it? Do not lie to me, you ungrateful little wretch." In my past life, I had jumped in terror, asking her what she meant. Today, I simply locked my phone screen, slipped it into my back pocket, and stood up. "If you're looking for the sapphire teardrop necklace," I said, my voice eerily calm, slicing through my mother's hysteria like a scalpel, "I suggest you check the false bottom of Alora's velvet jewelry box, the one hidden under the lavender sachets." The room went dead silent. Alora's fake sniffle hitched in her throat. The color drained from her perfectly rouged cheeks. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Stepping behind Roman, "Mom, she's lying, she's trying to deflect." "Am I?" I tilted my head, looking directly into my father's eyes. "No, check, Roman. It's a 5-minute walk down the hall. Or are you too afraid to ruin the illusion of your perfect, charity case daughter? How dare you speak to your father that way?" Madeline raised her hand, stepping forward to strike me. Before her palm could connect with my cheek, I caught her wrist midair. I didn't squeeze, but my grip was like iron. Madeline gasped, her eyes widening in shock. I had never, ever fought back before. "Don't," I whispered, dropping her hand as if touching her disgusted me. "I'm saving you the trouble of the theatrical search and the fake outrage." You want me gone. You want Alora to have the spotlight, the inheritance, and my fiancé. Fine. Keep them all. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy gold key to the estate, and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a loud, final clack. I'm leaving, I said, grabbing the handle of my trunk. Roman finally found his voice, his chest puffing out with authoritative anger. If you walk out that door, Sophia, you are dead to this family. I will freeze your cards. I will cut your tuition. You will crawl back here, starving within a week. I paused at the doorway, looking back at the three of them. They looked so small now, so insignificant. I'd rather starve on the streets than eat another meal at your table, I said. Goodbye, Mr. and Mrs. Harrington. I turned my back on them and walked down the grand marble staircase for the last time. I didn't look back when Madeline started screaming my name, nor when the heavy oak front door slammed shut behind me. For the first time in 21 years, the air tasted like freedom. The immediate aftermath of walking away from a billionaire family is profoundly unglamorous. There were no cameras, no dramatic slow motion walks into the sunset. There was just me, dragging a heavy trunk down a sweltering pavement until I flagged down a yellow cab. Where to, miss? The driver asked, eyeing my expensive trunk and my plain clothes in the rearview mirror, east side. The cheapest motel you know that doesn't have bed bugs, I replied, staring out the window. I settled into a dingy room that smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarettes. That cost me $1.50 a night. In my past life, I would have cried at the sight of the peeling wallpaper. Now I found it beautiful. It was mine. It wasn't bought with strings attached. I opened my laptop and went to work. I knew exactly what Roman was doing at that very moment. He was on the phone with his bankers, freezing my trust fund, my checking accounts, and canceling my credit cards. He thought he was cutting off my oxygen. He didn't know I had already severed the cord myself. The $5,000 in my lockbox was my seed money. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but I had something far more valuable, 3 years of future knowledge. I knew that in exactly 2 weeks, a small, virtually unknown biotech startup called Vanguard Labs was going to announce a breakthrough in cellular regeneration. Their stock, currently sitting at $0.42 a share, would skyrocket to over $80 within a month before a massive corporate buyout. I walked to a local bank, opened a new, unlinked account, deposited my cash, and opened a brokerage account. I dumped every single penny I had into Vanguard. Then I went out and got a job as a barista to pay for my cheap motel food. Meanwhile, back at the Harrington estate, the atmosphere was exactly as I predicted. I later learned from a sympathetic former maid that the day I left, Alora had indeed rushed to her room to find the necklace exactly where I said it was. She played the victim masterfully, claiming I must have planted it there to frame her. Madeline and Roman believed her, of course. They always did. Let her throw her little tantrum. Roman had sneered over dinner that night. She has no money, no skills, and no friends who will cross me. Give it 3 days. She'll be crying at the gates. 3 days passed. Then a week. Then a month. I didn't call. I didn't text. The silence began to unnerve them. They expected a performance, a groveling apology, a desperate plea for survival. Instead, I gave them a void. Fedor, my ex-fiancé, actually tried to track me down. He sent a few patronizing text messages before I permanently changed my number. Sophia, stop being childish. Come home. Apologize to Alora. And we can move past this. Reading that text in my motel room had made me laugh until my ribs ached. Theodore didn't miss me. He missed the submissive, quiet girl who made him look strong. He missed the Harrington connection that I provided. Without me, he was forced to deal with Alora's constant neediness. Something he would soon realize was a full-time job. By late August, my gamble paid off. Vanguard Labs made their announcement. The market went into a frenzy. I watched the green numbers tick upward on my cracked laptop screen with a cup of instant coffee in my hand. When the stock peaked at $84 a share, I sold everything. I had turned $5,000 into nearly $1 million. I didn't celebrate. I didn't go out and buy designer clothes or a sports car. I immediately rolled those funds into a commercial real estate short I knew was coming in the fall and began drafting a business plan. In my previous life, during my sickness, I had obsessively researched the failures of the Harrington Empire's supply chains. I knew every weak point, every corrupt vendor, every missed opportunity. I formed an LLC under an anonymous trust. I named it Vanguard Logistics. I started buying up the very shipping contracts. Rome and Harrington was too arrogant to renew, knowing their value would triple when the trade routes shifted next year. As the leaves turned brown and winter approached, I moved out of the motel and into a sleeve-secure penthouse apartment downtown. I built a team. I worked 20 hours a day. I poured my trauma, my anger, and my grief into a relentless drive for success. 6 months after I walked out of that house, I was no longer Sophia Harrington, the discarded daughter. I was Sophia, the CEO, and it was time to let my family know that the ghost they thought they buried was very much alive. The Winter Solstice Gala was the crown jewel of the city's high society. Hosted by the Carmichael family, Theodore's parents, it was an event where millions of dollars were disguised as charity and reputations were made or destroyed over champagne flutes. In my past life, I was forbidden from attending. I had been freezing in a rundown shelter while Alora danced in my custom-made gown, officially announcing her relationship with Theodore. At night, however, I was an invited guest, not as a Harrington, but as the elusive founder of Vanguard Logistics, the new company that was aggressively cornering the regional shipping market. I arrived an hour late, perfectly timed for maximum impact. I stepped out of my chauffeur-driven car, wearing a backless, midnight blue silk gown that clung to my curves like liquid glass. My hair was swept up in a sharp, elegant twist and bare of any jewelry, save for a pair of flawless diamond studs. I didn't need heirlooms to shine anymore. When the heavy ballroom doors opened and I was announced, the murmurs in the room died down. Heads turned, glasses paused halfway to lips. I walked down the grand staircase with the posture of a queen inspecting her subjects. I felt the eyes on me. I saw the recognition dawn on the faces of the socialites who hadn't seen me in 6 months. They expected me to look broken, emaciated, or desperate. Instead, I looked dangerous. It didn't take long for the bloodhounds to find me. I was at the bar, casually sipping a club soda with lime, when a familiar, arrogant voice spoke behind me. "Sophia." I turned slowly. The door stood there, looking dashing in a tailored tuxedo, a champagne glass in his hand. His eyes swept over me, widening an undeniable shock, followed quickly by a spark of possessive hunger. Beside him, clinging tightly to his arm, was Alora. She was wearing the infamous sapphire teardrop necklace. It looked gaudy against her pale skin. "Hello, Theodore," I said. My tone is casual, as if I were greeting a stranger at a bus stop. He let my eyes drift to Alora. "Alora, I see you managed not to lose the necklace this time." Alora flinched, her grip on Theodore's arm tightening. "Sophia," she breathed, her eyes darting around the room to see who was watching. What are you doing here? How did you get in?" "Through the front door," I replied smoothly. Or stepped forward, lowering his voice, trying to assert dominance. "Sophia, this isn't a game. You can't just crash my family's gala to make a scene. Where have you been? Your parents have been worried sick." "Worried sick?" I chuckled, the sound devoid of any humor. Is that what Roman calls freezing my bank accounts and sending a private investigator to try and ruin my credit? "Tell me, Theo, did you rehearse that line? Or did Madeline write it for you?" Before Theodore could formulate a retort, the crowd parted. Madeline and Roman pushed their way through the throng of onlookers. Madeline's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and immediate anger. Roman looked like a vein was about to pop in his forehead. "Sophia," Roman barked, stepping into my personal space. The chatter in the room completely ceased. Someone was watching the Harrington family drama unfold. "What is the meaning of this? You disappear for 6 months, embarrass us, and now you show up here dressed like a socialite. Whose money are you spending? Who brought you here?" He assumed naturally that I had found a rich man to fund me. The misogyny was as predictable as it was pathetic. I didn't back down. I didn't shrink. I stepped into his space, forcing him to look down at me, and yet I was the one looking down on him. "I bought myself here, Roman," I said clearly, ensuring my voice carried across the silent ballroom, "and I bought this dress with my own money. Money I made after you threw me out on the street for a crime your precious Alora committed." "Keep your voice down," Madeline hissed, her eyes darting to the whispering elite around us. "You are making a fool of us." "No, Madeline," I smiled, a chilling dead smile. "You made fools of yourselves. I am just here to close a tab." I opened my small silk clutch and pulled out a certified cashier's check. I had prepared this specifically for tonight. I held it out between my index and middle finger, right in front of Roman's face. "What is this?" He growled, not taking it. "As a check for $250,000, I announced clearly. "I calculated the cost of my food, board, basic clothing, and public school tuition from the day you brought me into your house until the day I walked out." With interest, gasps echoed through the room. Alora buried her face in Theodore's shoulder, trying to squeeze out tears that weren't there. "Take it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Take it, and know that my debt to the Harrington family is paid in full. We are not blood, we are not family. And if you ever try to interfere in my life again, I won't just walk away. I will dismantle everything you have built." Roman's hands were shaking. He was a man who ruled by financial intimidation. Having someone buy their freedom from him was a public castration of his power. When he didn't take it, I let the check flutter from my fingers. It landed face up on the polished marble floor, right at his expensive Italian leather shoes. "Enjoy the gala," I said to them. I turned my gaze to Theodore, who was staring at me with a mixture of awe and regret. "And Theo, good luck. You're going to need it." I turned on my heel and walked away, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. I didn't look back to see them scrambling to pick up the check or hiding their faces from the mocking whispers of their peers. I felt the phantom weight of my past life lift completely from my shoulders. The war had just begun, but I had already won the first battle. By the spring of 2019, the name Vanguard Logistics was no longer just a whisper among the elite. It was a blaring siren in the corporate shipping world. I didn't just want to build a successful company. I wanted to systematically dismantle the Harrington empire, brick by bleeding brick. In my previous life, I had spent my final agonizing months confined to a sterile hospital bed, ignored by the people who had raised me. With nothing else to do, I had studied Roman's public financial disclosures, reading between the lines of his quarterly earnings. I knew his margins were shockingly thin. I knew he was overleveraged, relying entirely on 3 massive legacy contracts to keep his fleet afloat. The biggest of these was the Caldwell Aeronautics account. William Caldwell was an old-school billionaire, fiercely loyal but notoriously impatient with delays. Roman had grown complacent, assuming Caldwell would never jump ship after 30 years of partnership. He was wrong. I spent weeks meticulously analyzing Caldwell's shipping routes. I found the inefficiencies Roman was charging him for the bloated warehousing fees, the outdated tracking software, the fuel surcharges that padded Roman's pockets. When I finally requested a meeting with William Caldwell, I didn't walk in with a standard pitch deck. I walked in with a surgical breakdown of how the Harringtons were essentially robbing him blind. "You're asking me to break a 3-decade alliance, Miss Harrington," Caldwell had said, peering at me over his mahogany desk. His sharp, calculating eyes weighed my youth against the brutal accuracy of my data. "I am no longer a Harrington, Mr. Caldwell. I am the CEO of Vanguard," I replied, holding his gaze without a flinch. "And I am not asking you to break an alliance. I am offering to stop a hemorrhage. Roman is overcharging you by 14% annually to cover his own failing European subsidiaries. Vanguard will cut your transit times by 2 days, implement real-time satellite tracking, and save you $20 million a year. The numbers don't lie. Roman does. It took him exactly 48 hours to sign the exclusive contract with Vanguard. In the news broke, the fallout was instantaneous. Harrington stock plummeted 9% in a single afternoon. I was sitting in my corner office, overlooking the city skyline, when my private line rang. It was an unlisted number, but I recognized the cadence of the heavy breathing on the other end instantly. "Sophia," Theodore's voice crackled through the receiver. He sounded ragged, stripped of the smug superiority he had worn like a second skin at the winter solstice gala. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Theo? If you're calling to congratulate me on the Caldwell account, an email would have sufficed." "Stop it, please," he pleaded. The desperation was thick and oily. "Sophia, Roman is tearing the office apart. He's looking for a mole. He thinks someone leaked proprietary data to you. Roman's incompetence is public record if you know where to look. I don't need a mole when your prospective father-in-law is legally blinding himself with arrogance." I leaned back in my leather chair, twirling a solid gold pen. How is Alora handling the stress? Is she being the supportive, brilliant partner you threw me away for? A heavy, telling silence hung on the line. I smiled. In my past life, Alora's chronic anxiety and complete lack of emotional regulation had been a closely guarded family secret, something I had constantly covered up for her. Without me there to absorb her panic attacks and manage her tantrums, Theo was undoubtedly drowning in her toxicity. "She's difficult," Theo finally admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper as if terrified she might be listening at his door. "Sophia, I made a mistake. A massive, unforgivable mistake. The gala. Seeing you there, seeing what you've built. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. Alora is a child, you are a force of nature." My stomach churned with absolute revulsion. He was just as parasitic as I remembered. He didn't love me, he loved power, and the scent of power had shifted from the Harrington estate to my penthouse. "Is that so?" I murmured, seeing my tone intentionally soft, dangling the bait. "It's a little late for regrets, Theo. It doesn't have to be," he urged, seizing on what he thought was a flicker of hesitation. "Let me see you, just for coffee. I can explain everything. I know things about Roman's upcoming quarterly strategy, Sophia. Things Vanguard could use." He was willing to sell out the Harringtons just to secure a lifeboat for himself. It was almost too easy. "Fine," I said smoothly. "The Onyx Lounge at the Pierre Hotel. Tomorrow at 8 in the evening. Don't be late." I hung up the phone and immediately drafted an anonymous email to Alora's personal address. I knew she was deeply insecure, constantly monitoring Theodore's whereabouts. The email contained only a time, a location, and a single sentence. "Ask your fiancé who he's really meeting tonight." The Onyx Lounge was a haven of dim, amber lighting, plush velvet booths, and discreet service, the perfect place for illicit corporate espionage and sordid affairs. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a sharply tailored crimson suit, and seated myself in a corner booth that offered a clear view of the entrance. Theodore arrived precisely at 8. He had clearly spent hours getting ready. His hair was perfectly coiffed, and he wore a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed desperate old money. When he saw me, his eyes lit up with a pathetic mixture of relief and predatory hunger. He slid into the booth opposite me, immediately reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. I didn't pull away, not yet. "You look breathtaking, Sophia," he murmured, his thumb brushing my knuckles. "I've missed you. God, I've missed you so much. You said you had information, Theo." I deflected coldly, keeping my expression neutral. "Let's skip the romantic revisions of history. What does Roman have planned?" He swallowed hard, leaning in closer. "He's desperate. Losing Caldwell backed him into a corner. He's pulling liquid capital from the family trust to secure a high-risk, offshore maritime contract with a firm called Castile Freight. If he lands it, it stabilizes the stock. If he doesn't, the board might force a vote of no confidence." I committed the name to memory. Castile Freight. In my previous life, Roman had made a similar move, and it had been a moderate success, but things were different now. He was making this move out of panic, not strategy. "And why are you telling me this?" I asked, tilting my head. As I won out, Theodore hissed, and his facade cracking, "Alora is driving me insane. She spends money like water. She throws tantrums when she isn't the center of attention, and Madeline coddles her. The Harrington name is sinking, Sophia, and I refuse to drown with them. Take me with you. We were a good team once. We can be again." He looked so earnest, so thoroughly convinced of his own value that I almost laughed. Before I could respond, the heavy glass doors of the lounge flew open. Alora stormed in. She was a vision of frantic chaos, wearing a designer trench coat thrown hastily over pajamas. Her hair wild, her eyes redrimmed and erratic. She scanned the dimly lit room like a hawk, and when her eyes locked onto our booth specifically, into Theodore's hand covering mine, she let out a sound that was half sob, half shriek. "You bastard!" Alora screamed, her voice shattering the quiet sophistication of the lounge. Heads snapped in our direction. Security guards by the door instantly went on alert. Theodore yanked his hand back, as if my skin had caught fire. All the blood drained from his face. Evie, wait. It's not what it looks like. You lied to me. You said you were at a board meeting." She marched over, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. She glared at me, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "And you vindictive, jealous bitch. You couldn't handle that he chose me, so you're trying to seduce him back." I calmly picked up my glass of sparkling water, took a slow sip, and leaned back against the velvet cushions. "Seduce him? Alora, please. I have more important things to do than dig through your recycling bin. Theodore stood up, trying to grab her shoulders to contain the scene. Alora, keep your voice down. We are just discussing business. Business? She shrieked, slapping his hands away. You're selling my father out to her. I heard you on the phone this morning. You're a traitor, Theo. The entire lounge was watching now. All phones were discreetly angled in our direction. The socialite ruin of the Carmichael and Harrington alliance was being recorded in real time. Theo was just telling me about your father's desperate gamble with Castile Freight, I said loudly, ensuring my voice carried to the neighboring tables. It's a shame the Harrington empire has been reduced to relying on a man who begs his ex-fiancée for a job while holding her hand. Theodore looked like he was going to vomit. Alora let out a guttural scream and grabbed Theodore's cocktail glass from the table, throwing the amber liquid directly into his face. We are done. She sobbed hysterically. And my father will destroy both of you. She turned and sprinted out of the lounge, pushing past a waiter and nearly knocking over a tray of champagne. Theodore stood there, dripping with scotch, staring at me with a look of absolute horror. He finally realized he hadn't played me. He had been the pawn in my trap all along. You set me up, he whispered, wiping the alcohol from his eyes. Consider it payback for the day you stood in my bedroom doorway and watched them throw me onto the street, I replied, standing up and smoothing out my crimson suit. Send me the dry cleaning bill, Theo. It's the last penny you'll ever get from a Harrington. I walked out of the lounge, leaving him standing there in the ruins of his engagement and his career. The scandal hit the tabloids the next morning. Hipping high-risk meltdown, fiancé caught with rival sister. The stock market reacted immediately to the instability. Harrington Logistics took another brutal dive. But I wasn't finished. Theodore had given me the final piece of the puzzle. Castile Freight. I didn't need to steal the contract. I just needed to make it toxic. Using my offshore Vanguard accounts, I quietly hired private investigators to dig into Castile's maritime safety records. Within a week, we anonymously leaked proof to the Maritime Commission that Castile was operating vessels that routinely failed environmental compliance, masking massive oil leaks. The commission suspended Castile's operating licenses overnight. Roman Harrington had already transferred $80 million in liquid capital money, borrowed against his own real estate, to secure the Castile partnership. With their licenses frozen, the contract was nullified, and the funds were locked in international litigation purgatory. Roman was completely, utterly out of cash. The smell of desperation is a tangible thing. It smells like stale sweat masking, expensive cologne, like frantic whispers behind closed mahogany doors, and like the ozone burn of overworked paper shredders. By November 2019, the Harrington empire was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The cold well loss had severed an artery. The Castile Freight disaster had paralyzed their nervous system. But the final fatal blow came from Alora. Desperate to prove she wasn't just the spoiled liability, the tabloids painted her as after the Onyx Lounge incident. Alora had forged Roman's signature to authorize a massive, unregulated investment into a phantom cryptocurrency logistics startup. She thought she was going to be the family's savior. Instead, she handed $30 million of corporate reserve funds to a sophisticated boiler room scam in Eastern Europe. The money vanished into thin air within 48 hours. When the bank auditors arrived for their quarterly review, the gaping hole in the balance sheet triggered an immediate default clause on their primary corporate loans. First Liberty Bank called in the debt, $250 million, due in 30 days. In my past life, Roman would have relied on his aristocratic network to bail him out. But his reputation was toxic. Theodore's family had publicly severed ties after the scandal, and the rest of high society smelled blood in the water. No one was going to catch a falling knife. I, however, was waiting at the bottom of the drop. I set up a meeting with Charles Kensington, the senior vice president of risk management at First Liberty. Kensington was a ruthless pragmatist who cared only about his bank's bottom line. Miss Harrington Kensington greeted me, offering a polite but guarded smile as I entered his corner office. Or should I say Vanguard CEO, to what do I owe the pleasure? We rarely see vultures circling this early. I'm not a vulture, Charles. I'm an investor, I said, taking a seat and sliding a thick, leather-bound portfolio across his desk. I know Roman Harrington is in default. I know he has 29 days left before you force him into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which will tie your bank up in litigation for years while his assets depreciate. You'll be lucky to recover 60 cents on the dollar. Kensington steepled his fingers, his eyes narrowing, and your alternative. Vanguard will buy the Harrington corporate debt, all $250 million today in cash. Kensington's guarded demeanor cracked. He leaned forward, staring at me as if I had just offered to buy the moon. You have $250 million in liquid capital. I have aggressive, anonymous backers who believe in Vanguard's hostile takeover strategy. I lied smoothly. In reality, I had leveraged my own soaring stock and secured massive lines of credit based on Vanguard's ironclad contracts to pull this off. It was a massive risk, but I was playing to win the war. You get your bad debt off the books at 100% face value. You look like a genius to your board. And I get the paper. Kensington opened the portfolio, reviewing the certified proof of funds. He was silent for 3 long minutes. Finally, he looked up, a predatory grin spreading across his face. Where do I sign? 5 days later, the Harrington Logistics Board of Directors convened an emergency meeting. The atmosphere in the opulent wood-paneled boardroom was suffocating. Roman sat at the head of the long oak table, looking 10 years older. His hair, usually a distinguished silver, looked thin and lifeless. His face was a map of stress lines. Madeline sat to his right, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, while Alora slouched to his left, staring blankly at the table, heavily medicated to keep her from having another public breakdown. And quote, "We need more time," Roman was arguing, his voice hoarse as he addressed the grim-faced board members. "If we liquidate the European assets, we can restructure the bank loans." "The bank doesn't own your loans anymore," Roman, an older board member, interrupted, checking a message on his tablet. "First Liberty just filed the transfer of debt. They sold it." Roman froze. Sold it to whom? Right on cue, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. I walked in. I didn't wear a power suit this time. I wore a simple, elegant black dress, reminiscent of morning attire, paired with a pair of stiletto heels that clicked against the hardwood floor like the ticking of a doomsday clock. 2 of my top corporate attorneys flanked me, carrying briefcases thick with legal documentation. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. To me, I answered, projecting my voice across the cavernous room. Roman shot out of his chair, on hatred rooted, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "What is this?" "Security, get her out of here. This is a closed corporate board meeting." "Actually, Roman," I said, walking slowly toward the head of the table. "As of 9:00 a.m. this morning, Vanguard Logistics, LLC, is the primary debt holder of this corporation. By the covenants of your default, I have the right to immediately call the debt, seize controlling equity, and restructure the board. You don't call security on me. I own the building the security guards are standing in." Madeline let out a choked gasp, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. Alora simply stared at me, her eyes wide with a terror that finally penetrated her pharmaceutical haze. "This is impossible," Roman stammered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. You were nothing, you had nothing, you're bluffing." I didn't argue. I simply gestured to my lead attorney, who stepped forward and distributed copies of the finalized debt transfer and the legal notice of default to every board member at the table. I watched the board members read the documents. I watched their expressions shift from skepticism to shock and finally to cold, calculated self-preservation. They looked at Roman, and then they looked at me. The shift in power in the room was physical, like the change in air pressure before a hurricane. I walked right up to Roman. He was forced to look at the daughter he had discarded, the girl he had let freeze, the girl he had cursed to starve. 3 years ago, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet echoing in the dead, silent room, you told me I would crawl back to this family starving. You were wrong, Roman. I didn't come back starving. I came back to eat you alive. I turned to address the board, my voice snapping back to crisp professional authority. Gentlemen, as the majority equity holder following this default, my first motion is to remove Roman Harrington from his position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, pending a full forensic audit into corporate mismanagement and familial embezzlement. Do I have a second? Every single hand at the table went up. Roman collapsed back into his chair as if he had been shot. The empire had fallen, and I was the one holding the crown. The forensic audit of Harrington Logistics took exactly 3 weeks, and it was a bloodbath. When you strip away the velvet curtains of high society, you usually find a house of cards held together by spit, fraud, and arrogance. I had my lead investigator, a ruthless ex-federal agent named Calvin Miller, tear through 30 years of Roman's personal and professional ledgers. What we found was far worse than corporate mismanagement. Roman had been systematically bleeding his own company dry to fund a secondary clandestine life. He had leveraged the main Harrington estate, the sprawling 8-bedroom limestone mansion in the Palisades, as collateral for the Castile freight gamble. Because Vanguard Logistics now owned that debt, and because Roman had defaulted, the estate legally belonged to me. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in early December when I decided it was time to collect. I didn't send an email. I didn't call. I arrived at the gated entrance of the Harrington estate in a sleek black SUV flanked by 3 private security contractors and a county sheriff to execute the formal eviction notice. The heavy iron gates, which I had been locked behind for 21 years, swung open at the sheriff's command. We drove up the sweeping gravel driveway. The front door was opened by Valerie, a veteran housekeeper who had always slipped me extra food when Madeline locked me in my room. When Valerie saw me stepping out of the SUV, her eyes widened, but a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Good morning, Valerie," I said, handing her a thick envelope. "That's a severance package from Vanguard Logistics, equivalent to 3 years of your salary, plus a glowing letter of recommendation. You don't have to clean up after them anymore." Valerie took the envelope, tears pooling in her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Sophia." They are in the morning room. I walked through the grand foyer, the clicking of my heels echoing off the imported Italian marble, the scent of fresh lilies and expensive coffee wafted from the morning room. I pushed the French doors open without knocking. Roman was pacing in his silk dressing gown, a phone pressed to his ear, shouting at his broker. Madeline was sitting at the glass table, aggressively massaging her temples. Elora was curled up on the Shades lounge, mindlessly scrolling through her phone, looking pale and hollowed out. The moment I stepped into the room, the sheriff and my security team filing in behind me, the air turned to ice. "Sophia," Madeline gasped, standing up so fast her chair tipped over backward. "What is the meaning of this? Get these people out of my house." "It's not your house anymore, Madeline," I said smoothly, pulling the deed and the foreclosure notice from my briefcase and dropping them onto her untouched breakfast plate. The estate was collateral on the First Liberty loans. Vanguard called the debt. The title transferred at 8:00 a.m. You have exactly 1 hour to pack whatever you can fit into 3 standard suitcases. Everything else, the art, the furniture, the jewelry bought with company funds stays. Roman dropped his phone. It shattered against the tile floor. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying realization of his own impotence. "You can't throw your own family out onto the street." "You did it to me," I reminded him, my voice devoid of any emotion. "On July 14, 2018, it took you exactly 30 minutes to pack my life into a single trunk. I'm giving you double the time. Consider it an act of grace." Elora sprang up from the lounge, her face twisted in a hysterical snarl. "You've indicative psycho. You planned this. You've always been jealous of me. You couldn't stand that Mom and Dad loved me more, that I was the true heir to grandmother's sapphire, that Theodore wanted me." I looked at Elora, genuinely pitying her delusion. I signaled for the sheriff to begin the countdown, then turned my attention back to the 3 of them. "Let's talk about that sapphire necklace, Elora," I said, walking over to the mantel where a portrait of Beatrice Harrington Roman's formidable mother hung. Beatrice hated Madeline. She wrote in her will that the heirloom sapphire was only to be worn by a woman of true Harrington blood. That's why you stole it and framed me. You were terrified that because you were adopted, Beatrice's trust would bypass you. "I am their daughter," Elora shrieked. "Are you?" I asked softly. I pulled a secondary folder from my briefcase. While auditing Roman's offshore accounts, Calvin Miller found a series of recurring highly concealed wire transfers dating back 24 years. They went to an account in the name of Josephine Miller, a former secretary at Harrington Logistics. Madeline froze. Her eyes slowly dragged away from me and locked onto Roman. "Roman, what is she talking about?" Roman's face had drained of all color. He looked like he was about to faint. "Madeline, please don't listen to her. She's fabricating documents. Josephine Miller gave birth to a daughter 22 years ago. I continued, my voice slicing through his lies. A daughter Roman claimed was a charity adoption to boost the family's philanthropic image. But there was no adoption agency was there, Roman. You brought your illegitimate daughter into the house, forced your wife to raise her, and gave her the life that should have been mine. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Alora stumbled backward, clutching her chest. No, that's a lie. Mom, tell her she's lying. But Madeline wasn't looking at Alora. She was staring at Roman with a gaze so full of venom and betrayal it could have melted steel. All these years, Madeline had championed Alora, pushed me aside to favor the poor, fragile, adopted girl, only to discover she had been raising her husband's bastard child from a sordid affair. Madeline's voice was a low, guttural hiss. She lunged at Roman, her manicured nails raking across his face, drawing deep, bloody lines down his cheek. You humiliating, disgusting pig. You made me raise her. You made me cast out Sophia for your horse's child. Security had to step in to pull Madeline off him. Roman was bleeding, cowering against the wall, a pathetic shadow of the titan he used to pretend to be. Alora was on her knees, screaming and sobbing, completely shattered by the destruction of her identity. 45 minutes, I announced, checking my watch. I turned and walked out of the morning room, the sounds of their family tearing itself to bloody shreds echoing behind me. I stood on the front porch, breathing in the cold December air. I had taken their money, their home, and their legacy, but exposing the rot at the core of their foundation, that was the kill shot. The descent of the Harrington family was swift and mercilessly public. Without the estate, without the company, and with their bank accounts frozen, pending federal investigation into the missing $30 million Alora had wired to the crypto scam, they had nowhere to go. Madeline, whose entire existence was predicated on social superiority, immediately filed for divorce. But it was a futile gesture. Half of zero is still zero. Her country club friends, the same women who had sipped champagne and laughed at my expulsion, stopped returning her calls. The Carmichael family officially issued a restraining order against Alora after she showed up at Theodore's apartment complex in the middle of the night, screaming and throwing rocks at his balcony. They ended up renting a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a decaying building on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was exactly 3 blocks from the motel I had stayed in during my first week of exile, Poetry. Theodore was the first to attempt to crawl back. He managed to bypass Vanguard's lobby security by slipping in with a catering crew. I was sitting in my office, finalizing the integration of Harrington Logistics shipping routes into Vanguard's system when my double doors flew open. Theodore stood there, looking disheveled. The bespoke suits were gone, replaced by a rumpled off-the-rack jacket. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent. Sophia, he breathed, stepping toward my desk before my executive assistant, a sharp woman named Valerie. Yes, the same Valerie whom I had hired to run my front office, grabbed his arm. I've already called building security, Miss Sophia. Valerie said firmly. It's all right, Valerie. Give us 2 minutes, I replied, leaning back in my chair. Theodore shook off her grip and approached my desk, placing both hands on the mahogany surface. He looked up at me with what he probably thought was an expression of soulful regret. Sophia, I'm ruined. The Carmichaels cut me off. The board fired me because of the scandal with Alora. I have nothing. And you brought this information to me because I raised an eyebrow. Because I know we still have a connection, he pleaded, his voice cracking. I know I was a coward. I was weak. I let Roman intimidate me. But I loved you. I never stopped loving you. Let me work for Vanguard. I know the Caldwell accounts better than anyone. I can be an asset to you, Sophia. We can be a power couple again. I stared at him. In my past life, this man's rejection had broken my heart. I had wept into my pillows, wondering why I wasn't enough, why he had chosen my sister over me. Looking at him now, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow. Just the mild irritation one feels when stepping in gum on the sidewalk. Theo, I said quietly, if you were the last man on Earth and Vanguard was the last company hiring, I would liquidate my assets, burn the cash, and walk into the ocean before I let you sweep the floors of my warehouse. The hopeful glimmer in his eyes died instantly, replaced by a dark, ugly resentment. You arrogant bitch. You think you're untouchable. I know the Harringtons' dirty secrets. I know things about you. You know nothing, I interrupted, pressing the intercom button. Security, please escort Mr. Carmichael off the premises. If he resists, break his legs and tell the police he tripped. 2 massive security guards hauled him out. He screamed my name all the way to the elevator, a pathetic symphony to my ears. But Theodore's desperation was nothing compared to my blood relatives. It happened 3 weeks later during a torrential downpour. I was leaving the Vanguard Tower late, walking toward my waiting car in the private underground garage. The air was damp and cold, the chilling reminder of the winter night I had died on those icy steps. As I approached the vehicle, a figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. It was Roman. He was soaked to the bone, wearing a cheap, thin trench coat that clung to his gaunt frame. His silver hair was matted to his skull. He looked older than time itself, a broken, shivering shell of a man. My security detail instantly moved to intercept, hands hovering over their holsters. I raised a hand, stopping them. I wanted to hear this. Roman shuffled forward, his shoes squelching on the concrete. He stopped 5 feet away from me. For a moment, he just stared, water dripping from his nose and chin. Then, to my absolute shock, his knees buckled. He dropped to the wet concrete floor. "Sophia," he croaked, his voice raw and pathetic. "Please, the great Roman Harrington, the man who had terrorized me, who had thrown me to the wolves, was on his knees in a parking garage." "Get up, Roman. You're embarrassing yourself," I said, my voice cold and flat. "I have nothing," he sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "Madeline took whatever cash was left in the divorce. Alora is facing federal wire fraud charges for the crypto scam. My lawyers have abandoned me. You're going to indict me for the embezzlement, Sophia. I'm going to die in prison." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, tears mixing with the rainwater. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. You were the brilliant one. You were the true Harrington. Please, Sophia, I am your father. You have the money. You have the power. Pay off the feds. Hire me a defense team. Let me live in the guest house. I'll do anything. I'll scrub the floors. Please don't let them take me." A memory flashed in my mind. A cold July afternoon. Me clutching his trousers, sobbing, begging him to look at the security footage, begging him to believe me. And Roman, sneering down at me, kicking me away as if I were diseased. I took a slow step forward, looking down at him. "Do you remember what you told me the day you threw me out?" I asked, the silence of the garage amplifying my words. "You said I would crawl back to you starving within a week." Roman flinched, closing his eyes. "I am not your daughter, Roman. I was an accessory to you, a prop for your family portrait until a better one came along. You didn't love me then, and you don't love me now. You just love the fact that my bank account can save your miserable life." I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number. I put it on speaker. "Detective Miller," I said into the phone. "Miss Harrington," the gruff voice of the federal financial crimes investigator answered. "What can I do for you?" "I have Roman Harrington here with me, in the Vanguard Tower underground garage. I believe he is a flight risk, and he is currently attempting to solicit me to bribe federal officials on his behalf." Roman let out a strangled, horrified gasp. "Sophia, no, please." "Understood," Miller replied sharply. "I have a unit 3 blocks away. Keep him there." I hung up the phone. Roman scrambled to his feet, slipping on the wet concrete. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated terror. He turned and tried to run toward the exit ramp, but my security detail easily tackled him to the ground, pinning him as he thrashed and wailed like a wounded animal. As the distant sound of police sirens began to wail through the city streets, growing louder by the second, I stepped into my warm, luxurious car. I didn't watch them put the handcuffs on him. I simply told my driver to take me home. The cleanup of the Harrington legacy took another year. The justice system is slow, but when it finally grinds, it grinds exceedingly fine. Madeline was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for massive corporate fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Because of his age and his sudden, steep decline in health, it was essentially a life sentence. Madeline moved into a tiny, subsidized apartment in a state she swore she would never set foot in. I heard through the grapevine that she works as a perfume associate at a mid-tier department store, forced to serve the very middle-class women she spent her life mocking. And Elora's trial for the $30 million wire fraud was a media circus. Her defense strategy was to plead temporary insanity, claiming the stress of discovering her true parentage had broken her mind. The judge didn't buy it. The paper trail of forged signatures was too meticulous, too calculated. She took a plea deal, 5 years in a minimum security facility. On the day she was being transferred to the prison, I did something I promised myself I wouldn't do. I went to the courthouse holding area to see her. She was sitting on a metal bench in an orange jumpsuit. The designer makeup was gone. Her hair was stringy and unwashed. The aristocratic aura she had stolen for 22 years had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified hollow girl. When she saw me standing on the other side of the reinforced glass, she didn't scream. She didn't rage. She just looked incredibly tired. She picked up the heavy black receiver. I picked up mine. "Did you come to gloat?" she asked, her voice raspy. "No," I replied truthfully. "I came to look at you one last time. I needed to see that the monster under my bed was just a frightened child all along." Laura stared at the metal table between us. "I hated you, Sophia. I hated that you were effortlessly smart. I hated that Theodore looked at you with respect, even when he claimed he loved me. I just wanted to be the main character in the story." "You were," I said softly. "You just wrote a tragedy." I hung up the phone. I walked out of the courthouse. The heavy steel door is locking behind me, severing the last physical tie I had to the Harrington family. By the summer of 2021, 3 years after the day I was reborn, the exact time I had originally died freezing on the steps of the estate, I was standing on the balcony of my penthouse. Watching the sunset paint the city in strokes of gold and violet, I took a deep breath. My lungs were clear. My heart was steady. There was no coughing. There was no pain. Vanguard Logistics had become a global titan. I had employed thousands of people, instituted sweeping reforms in the shipping industry, and built an empire that ran on precision and loyalty, not fear and fraud. The Harrington estate in the Palisades didn't sit empty. I gutted it, purged it of all its dark memories, and transformed it into the Vanguard Foundation for at-risk youth, a fully funded educational retreat for young women discarded by the system. I had rewritten my destiny. I didn't just survive the Harrington family. I eradicated their influence from my soul. I learned that blood doesn't make a family, and power is only as valuable as the peace it brings you. I was 24 years old. I had all the money in the world, a chosen family of colleagues and friends who respected me, and a future that belonged entirely to me. I lifted a glass of vintage champagne, the crystal catching the last rays of the sun, to rebirth. I whispered to the wind. I took a sip, turned away from the edge, and walked back inside to conquer the rest of my life. And that is how you burn an empire to the ground and build a castle from the ashes. Roman, Madeline, Alora, and Theodore thought they were playing a game of chess with a pawn, not realizing I had already flipped the board and become the queen. They wanted to see me starve, but instead, they watched me feast on their legacy. Rebirth isn't just about a second chance. It's about making sure the people who destroyed you in the past never even get to touch your shadow in the future. If this story of ultimate revenge, corporate warfare, and total domination gave you chills, you know what to do. Hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is massive success. And subscribe so you never miss another crazy, twist-filled, true life story. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you woke up 3 years before your worst day? See you in the next video.